Hello, my name is Seun Matiluko and I'm here today with Mr. Edwin Cameron as part of the OLBA Changemakers interview series. So hello, Mr. Cameron, thank you so much for joining me today.
What a joy to be with you and lovely to meet you.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to start by talking a bit about you, because I know that despite coming from humble beginnings, you've had a very distinguished career and are particularly well known for your activism on behalf of LGBT people and for being a former justice of the South African Constitutional Court. And so I was wondering what for you has been the proudest moment or the highlight of your career?
Oh, I suppose it was, I suppose, twofold, Seun. I would say helping to get sexual orientation into our country's constitution, which was a world first. I don't claim credit for it. I really give credit to my very sadly deceased comrade, Simon Nkosi, who died of AIDS in 1998. And Simon, by coming out while he was on trial for treason and murder to his fellow trialists, made it possible for us lawyers in suits, white men in suits, to argue to the constitutional negotiators that they had to include a sexual orientation. So not to take credit, but to say that it was a thrill and a joy and a source of pride. And then I think to serve my last 11 years as a judge, I served in the High Court for 6 and in the Appeal Court for 8. And then my last 11 years were in our country's constitutional court. It was tough work, it was grinding, but it was also a great joy.
It's interesting that you mentioned getting sexual orientation on the Constitution, actually, because I've just finished studying the BCL, and I studied a course on comparative human rights, which I think is taught by Sandy Fredman, which I think you did your BCL together, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
Yeah, and she assigned us an article that you wrote, I think in the 90s, about why sexual orientation should be listed as a protected characteristic in the South African Constitution. And I was hoping to ask you actually now, I think that almost 30 years on or several decades after the early 90s, do you think that the non-discrimination rights of gay and lesbian people are being upheld as well as they could be in South Africa? And also, do you think that the constitutional framework that South Africa has at the moment is best served to protecting the non-discrimination rights of gay and lesbian people? Or do you think that another jurisdiction might do it slightly better? Or if South Africa has anything to learn from other jurisdictions or anything like that?
Well, two grave questions, Seun. Let me start with the first, which is the answer is definitely, sadly, grievously, no. The rights of LGBTIQ people are not being protected simply because of constitutional equality. It was a magnificent achievement in itself. It's a wonderful promise. But as with other promises we've made to women, to Black people, non-racialism, women, no gender subordination, human dignity, and more importantly, in the material side, we promised our people access to the basic resources of life, the material conditions of life, food, water, schooling, and we failed to deliver after 27 years of democracy. So LGBTIQ people are within a big group of citizens for whom constitutional promises have not been fulfilled. But there's a special edge with queerness, Seun. We're in the African continent. Just before we started recording, we were speaking about your West African Nigerian origins. Probably the most homophobic enactment ever made by any human society in the world is the Nigerian 2013 anti-gay marriage statute. It says that any advocacy, that any propagation of gay equality amounts to advocacy of gay marriage, which one might actually rather tendentiously say is probably true, because if you want to be equal, you've got to be equal in every respect. But as a technical legal definition, it is breathtakingly wide. And that is a symptom of a continent-wide fury about queer equality. And it's particularly directed along race and class lines in our country at transgender Black people in townships, young gay presenting Black gay men, and very much so young Black lesbians. So there's a particularly poignant edge to the failure of protection and equality and dignity in our Constitution. Having said that, and before I come to the second part of your question, Seun, let me say why I called it glorious, because for young people, they know that whatever the deficits of constitutional carry through, whatever the deficits of real equality and dignity, they are right up there with everyone else. And young people tell me that it has made a difference to our self-conception as queer people, to me as a proudly gay man, to many, many, many young South Africans who are still 14 or 15 or 16, to know that the Constitution says you are equal, you are entitled to protection, even if we fail you in giving it. So if I may come to your second question, which and not evade it, you asked about other jurisdictions, Seun, and it's interesting because we had a tribunal in SADC, a SADC tribunal, which, while I was part of the Constitutional Court, we had to review our then president, President Jacob Zuma, who's having a rough week as we speak. I don't know when this will go up onto the OU website, but he, I think, shamefully colluded in the abolition of the SADC tribunal, Southern African Development Community. It was our nascent start to try to get to a European Union type of interstate association with a court. The tribunal was there and it had clout, it kicked butt. And it was precisely because it kicked butt that the President's Club, which is an elite association, which often seems only to protect the elites in Southern Africa, while they abolished it. We said that the President's participation in that was illegal and that he had to make all efforts under the Constitution to resuscitate the tribunal. So it's a long answer to your question, but to say that regional initiatives are enormously important for all kinds of vulnerable and marginalized groups. And that I think that LGBTI regionalization, continentalization, if there's such a word, I think all of those things are important as additional norms. The Yogyakarta principles in which I participated some years ago, protecting LGBTIQ people, they've also been important because people cite them and people know about them. I'm often asked about them. So there's much more that one can do. And behind your question, if you don't mind me peering through the curtain of what you asked, is the question of international norms and greater international association. And ultimately, behind your question lies the question of international criminal accountability. So our conversation is free. We can go to any of those places.
Yeah, there's so much in what you said that I think would be interesting to pick up on. I think maybe my first question would be, because I think I agree that it's great that sexual orientation is a protected characteristic in the South African Constitution, and it's right up there rather than protecting rights for gay people under privacy. It's right up there, it's explicit. But at the same time, these rights are not tangible for a lot of people. And so I wonder what you think the role of the law should be in upholding people's rights. Do you think that we overly focus on the law and instead we should be focusing on policy decisions and activism, or where's the role of the law in all of this? And then I think it might be interesting to talk about how to continue to fight for LGBTQI rights in Africa in particular, because if I'm not mistaken, I think that Africa is arguably the most homophobic continent. I think we've got the most countries with anti-LGBT laws, and as you say, in Nigeria, I think in northern Nigeria, you can be put to death for being gay, if I'm not mistaken. And I know I've encountered a lot of arguments from Africans who argue that being LGBTQI is a white Western colonial invention. And interestingly, at the same time, there are a number of activists in the West, conservative activists in the West, who are pouring a lot of money and energy into promoting anti-LGBT laws on the continent of Africa, I think particularly in Uganda. And so I guess my second question would be, in the face of all of this, how do we as Africans fight for better rights for LGBTQI people on the continent, but also what is the role of law in all of this? Do we overly focus on the law? Is it not important? What do you think?
What a lovely question, Seun, and I think that it bears directly on the broader African issues you raise. First of all, the law is obviously a normative standard. And I once sat next to the foreign minister of Malawi at a State House dinner in 2013. And he said to me, "You've gone about it the wrong way. You should have changed community attitudes first, and then you should have approached the law." I said to him, "Minister, you are wrong. You've got to start with the law. The law offers a beacon." So we had a disagreement right at this grand dinner. And I know it's a widespread view that we were precipitate in enacting, constitutionalizing equality on sexual orientation grounds. And then, of course, the law should also have bite. It should also have kick-butt efficacy. We are struggling in South Africa. I know that Deputy Minister John Jeffrey is struggling with getting the hate crimes bill through. I think hate crimes bills are important. They're important in the UK, where you are based, in North America and Western Europe. They should also be enacted in Russia and elsewhere in the world, in South America and in the Middle East and North Africa and Australasia. So the law can be given greater particularity and teeth. So those are the roles of the law. And of course, once part of the difficulty with criminalizing queer conduct, even in private between adults, is that it leaves a stigma. Whereas if you do the reverse and say queer people are entitled to equality, you help destigmatize people. But then the more important implication of your question, Seun, is really about activism. And it goes back to what I said at the beginning of our interview about Simon Seko Nkosi. He was a young man from an impoverished township about 60 kilometers south from where I'm sitting now in Johannesburg. And he participated in the mass uprising against the apartheid local government system of September 1984. He was arrested for treason and for murder, put on trial with about a dozen and a half, 20 other people, and came out to them. Astonishing, staggering, the courage and the presence of mind of Simon to do it. His fellow trialists initially rejected him. They said, "We don't want you to dish our food up. We want you to go into a cell." And he said, "I don't accept that." He fought them. So Simon's achievement was not only an achievement of exceptional personal courage, but it was also an achievement of activism. To say, "Here I am, and I am everywhere." If I'm in Sebokeng, if I'm in the Delmas treason trial, and if I'm black, and if I'm poor, it means that I'm one of the 7 to 10%. And we know now, and it's increasingly accepted, whether you're in a Middle Eastern, North African Muslim country, whether you're a Talmudic, Jewish, observant, rigorous Jewish observant person. Let me tell you, right here this afternoon, 7 to 10% of you, they might not acknowledge it, they might not self-identify, but there would be features of their inner self or of their disposition which we would classify as gender diverse or sexual or same-sex orientationally attracted. So it's a universal phenomenon, and the key, and here I'm going to finish off with my answer to your question, the key is visibility. In South Africa, we achieved visibility, and Simon gave the lie to that pernicious untruth that this is about white middle-class people. I was white and middle-class. Simon was my comrade. We worked together. We helped organize the first LGBTIQ march on African soil together, which took place in October 1990. He and Beverly Ditsie were the most prominent organizers. I was on legal standby, as I was for most of my life as an activist, safely in my suit and tie. But I was there in case the Chief Magistrate of Johannesburg refused permission for the march. We were ready to go. So the visibility is key. And there are very brave Nigerians, Ghanaians, Ivorians, Cameroonians, Tanzanians, Zambians, extraordinarily brave people who are doing now what Simon did in 1985 to his fellow trialists. And why visibility is important is because of what I said Simon achieved, which is that every family of more than 9 or 10 people has got a queer person of some sort, maybe bisexual, maybe secret longings, and maybe someone who knows who and what they are but hasn't spoken about it yet. So to open to remove the mask and to move towards dignity and equality and recognition, coming out is important, and that is happening all over Africa right now.
But with visibility, though, I think maybe how do we get around the danger of that, though? Because I think as someone who was born in the UK and grew up in the UK, I think it's very easy for me to come out or say, I know many out and open LGBT Ghanaians in the UK have spoken about anti-LGBT hate crimes on the continent and also in Ghana, talking about a particular law that is being discussed at the moment. And I think it's easy for us in the West to be visible. But what about people on the African continent, particularly, as I say, in northern Nigeria in particular, where you could be put to death? How do we get around the danger of it all? Or is that not something we can get around?
No, we can. And it's an important question, because the first thing to understand is that coming out doesn't have to be on the front page of the newspaper or on your Instagram account or on your Facebook page. You can come out when you come out to your mum or to your fellow congregant in your congregation, or in your mosque or in your tabernacle. You are coming out, you are making a political statement to your best friend. And that in itself is an intrinsically political act. It's a deeply personal act to say, I want you to recognize my anguish in being oppressed and coming into a world that treats me as abnormal and unbiblical and unquranic and untalmudic. I want you to recognize that and to know that I am queer or gay or lesbian, however you would wish to express it. So it doesn't have to be a bugle. It's important what Simon did, because he came out to his trialists and it became known. But when I came out at about the same time as Simon, I started off in my family. I started off in my professional circle. It wasn't always easy. And that's what's happening already in Africa. In Kenya, for example, there are very active organizations. The courage displayed by people like Frank Mugisha and other people in Uganda is beyond expression. And then you think of the two Malawian men, Stephen Mwongeza and Tibonga Chimbalanga. Now, Tibonga self-identifies as a trans woman, but when they announced their intention to get married in a rural area of Malawi in 1989, they did a sensational thing. It wasn't a self-identifiedly political act, but they knew that they were doing something enormously important and transgressive. The Western press seized on it. It transformed itself into a media spectacle. They paid an enormous price for it. But at the same time, their courage led to their president, the Malawian president, backing down and releasing the two of them from jail. So it's a difficult question you ask. And I would say there's got to be political change. That's why I was asked by two activists from one of our neighboring countries what they can do to further equality in their country. And I said, have you asked the lawyers? Is your bar association or your attorneys association or your lawyers guild affiliated to the International Bar Association, which condemns discrimination on sexual orientation grounds? Have they accounted to the IBA? Is there a human rights commission in your country? Is there churches council? I know that some churches are deeply conflicted. They're still rooted in what I understand is the misinterpretation of Quranic and biblical texts. I don't know. I'm not a biblical or Quranic or Talmudic scholar, but many people tell me that those are misinterpretations. But many people in the churches and in the Islamic and Judaic faiths are accepting of queerness. So there's a lot that we can do, and it doesn't have to be by fighting the nuclear war at the end of the struggle. It starts by step by step right at the beginning.
Again, there's so much to pick up in your answer, but I think perhaps two things to talk about perhaps are the role of law and the international community, and perhaps also religion. Because I think even though there are some people in Africa who suggest that being LGBTQI is some sort of white Western thing, in a lot of pre-colonial Africa, attitudes towards LGBTQI people were very, very different. But after the introduction of Christianity and colonialism, things changed. And now we continue to see, I think, particularly evangelical Americans pushing for anti-LGBT laws on the continent. And so I wonder, where do you see the role of the international community, if any, in helping change things on the continent?
Well, let us first start by saying that it really is a dastardly lie. And of course, there were in pre-colonial societies, there are even words, there are pre-colonial words in the Bantu languages of Southern Africa, which express same-sex conduct. So it shows that this didn't come with the arrival of the white people. In fact, to go back to something you said earlier, Seun, yes, more countries in Africa, yes, more countries in the British Commonwealth continue to criminalize same-sex consensual private adult conduct than anywhere else. It's a legacy of colonialism. The British arrived in Uganda and were horrified to find that there was a history of homosexuality. I think it's in the Buganda. Forgive the Baganda, forgive me if I'm wrong about that, but certainly one of the major cultural and ethnic groupings of Uganda. So it's a colonial legacy of India. Section 397 was only abolished in India by the Supreme Court a few years ago. It was a colonial statute. So we know that in all societies, there are queer people, and they should be recognized and given the dignity of who they are. So let me get to the second part of your question, which is about how international pressure can help. Well, Prime Minister David Cameron showed us how you don't do it. He came to Africa and he said, if you naughty Africans don't line up properly and be nice to your queer people, we're going to withhold our aid. Thank you, Prime Minister Cameron. Go back to London and please keep quiet for a while. He should have done it very differently. He had good intentions, but it sounded as though he was patronizing African societies, and he was patronizing queer people within those societies. But there are things that can be done. My advice to international donors and to international agencies is to empower local people. If there's a Simon Cordy or a Stephen Mwongeza or a queer activist like Frank Mugisha or the Kenyan activists who are very visible, empower them, help them. I don't mean help in a condescending sense. Give them money, give them materials, give them structural support so that they can do in their society what they know is necessary there.
And you know, something that's interesting, something that's been interesting for me in this conversation is that you've used the term LGBTQI, but you've also used the term queer. And I know that some older people within the LGBTQI community really, really dislike the term queer. And so I was wondering what the term queer means to you, and what do you think of the evolution of language that's happened within the LGBTQI community in general?
It's a self-appropriation, Seun, and it's thank you for asking that. And I grew up terrified. I still think I'm 68 now, and I can think back more than 60 or 50 years to my fear of being called a sissy or a queer or all the horrible things that they referred to, pansy, a fruit, all of those things. And it's still a hurtful memory in me. So part of how we respond to that hurt is to say, to hell with you. And of course, that's what's happened in Black American culture. It has not happened in South Africa with the K word, the most vile racist word almost anywhere in the world, is a word that we as whites, I grew up to my shame with that word. Speaking of Black people, it's an extremely derogatory and humiliating word. It's not been self-appropriated by Black South Africans, but queerness has, and the N word has been appropriated. As a white person, I wouldn't dream of using the N word, but Black Americans, some of them do, both in rap culture and elsewhere. So I've got great respect for people who say, you still hurt me when you refer to yourself as queer. And I say that this is part of the struggle, and I will stick to more and more acceptable terminology, because there's no point in creating hurt within the LGBTI community about terminology.
Speaking about the community in general, there's been an interesting fracture within some parts of the community recently, in which some people say that because having a particular sexual orientation is distinct from having a certain gender identity, lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, or LGBT people, should fight separately from trans people or T people. So in the UK recently, we had formed an LGBT Alliance for that reason. So a group of lesbian, gay, bisexual people who say that they're different from trans people and they don't want to work in coalition with trans people. This is their separate organization. And I wonder, what do you think about that, given your experience in the struggle for non-discrimination rights for LGBTQI people?
Well, given my experience, which is mostly ignorance, let's start off by saying that within gay and men having sex with men communities and circles, there's long been gynophobia, anti-woman prejudice, lesbian jokes. Within the LGB community, there's rank ignorance. I read and gave a cover endorsement and have spoken on platforms in the last month with a friend of mine who's a trans man, Robert Hamblin, whom I met when she came to photograph me soon after I'd become a judge in the 1990s as Adele Hamblin. She's now a trans man, and her book, I read this book in the last few months, and it was deeply moving and humbling because it showed me my own ignorance. So if the separation of movements is saying you've got your own issues, you are cisgendered, or you don't have the affirmation issues, the surgical and other affirmation issues that we have, I would respect that. At the same time, I would want us to find our commonalities as well. That fundamentally, this resistance to trans people and to queer people is about our gender identity and sexuality. And when you say to me that you are trans, you're saying something fundamental about your erotic disposition, about how your body doesn't reflect the way you feel. I don't want to articulate it more because I'll get it wrong. But that's also true for me as a queer man, that when I tell an audience I'm gay, I'm telling them something terribly intimate. So let us not, in recognizing and respecting the distinctnesses of our struggle and of our social beings, let us not forget our commonalities as well.
I think that's a very well considered answer, but I think the contention for some people within the LGBT Alliance to represent them fairly is that they think that so one of the many arguments they make is that if a girl is tomboyish, that girl might later become a lesbian. But they're suggesting that in our present society, that girl would be encouraged to think that she's a transgender person, for example. They think it's a new form. They've claimed that it's a new form of conversion therapy, almost, is their language, which has caused a lot of controversy in the UK. And so, yeah, I wonder where you sit with that they have a lot of claims about saying that, transgender women are really men and lesbians shouldn't have relationships with transgender women, and gay people shouldn't have relationships with transgender men, etc. And so they've used inflammatory language in the UK, which is why they've got a lot of backlash. But there are also a lot of people who see their point and are worried that with trans activism, the voices of LGBT people will be silenced, if any of that makes sense or hits with you at all.
No, it does. I must confess again to rank ignorance, and I'm in terrible danger here of barging right into a controversy that I'm not properly informed about. But is it not imposing a new form of restrictiveness to say who should and who shouldn't be having? Robert is in a relationship with a woman. I think we have to, part of what we fought for is not to create new boundaries, but to say there is really a fluidity. It doesn't mean that you're queer if you've once thought that the hockey coach has got great legs, or if a bearded man has attracted you as a young boy, or if you wanted to be embraced by another man, and then you settle down with an opposite sex partner. We don't have to categorize people and restrict them. So with a risk of not knowing where the debate comes from, I would be very against restrictiveness and against moralizing. Seun, what we fought against, what we have in common with trans people and with sex workers. I'm sometimes asked by audiences, are LGBTI people in South Africa the most marginalized group? I say no. Cross-border migrants are a problem that you have in Europe as well. And we have one of the biggest cross-border migrancy populations in the world. And sex workers, it's a moralizing, vindictive stigma placed upon people about how they use their bodies, how they wish to be proud of their bodies. And we have no entitlement to say to a woman or to a man or to a trans person, you are not allowed to use your body for income generation. We should tell that to athletes as well, and to all people who work, do physical work. And we should extend that to the brain as well, if we're being entirely logical, driving the point home. We have no entitlement. So are we not saying to people then how you should use your bodies? That's what we fought for. And our struggle should include all aspects of that kind of moralism, and we should reject it wherever it occurs.
Thank you for that answer. I was hoping to switch gears a little bit now to talk about race, yes. Because I thankfully was born a couple of years after apartheid ended, but I think reading about apartheid, it becomes easy to come to the conclusion that perhaps the majority of white people in apartheid South Africa were racist towards Black people. And you yourself have mentioned that you grew up with the K word, for example. And so I thought it might be useful to ask you, how did you go about unlearning racism? Because I think this is a very important question given the recent context of Black Lives Matter and more white people wanting to be allies in the struggle against racism. I wanted to know, how did you come to the conclusion that racism was wrong despite growing up in a racist society? And why did you want to join the struggle against apartheid?
Thank you very much, Seun, for asking that. The first thing I'd say is that I don't think you unlearn racism. And part of the reason for me giving that answer is that it's a lifelong process, which doesn't mean that you can't make progress in disavowing, interrogating, hunting out, and dispelling your own racist preconceptions about all sorts of people. But more importantly, the point is that racism is not only an attitudinal thing, it's a deeply systemic thing. It's the systemic issue that has dogged Britain, which was the slave trader of the world and built All Souls College right near to where you are sitting, very close to the Gulbenkian Law Library, is the Codrington Law Library, built with Barbadian sugar from Barbadian slaves. So Britain, as the colonial master, has structured itself on wealth accrued from treating Black people as subordinate, as instruments of labor, as chattels, as things that could be lynched and beaten and treated with terrible cruelty. So there's this deeply systemic thing dimension, which goes beyond unlearning racism. But let me make it personal as well, because I do believe in whiteness, and I believe that whiteness continues to exist beyond its disavowal. I grew up poor in a fractured household. I was put with my two elder sisters in a children's home for nearly 5 years. But I got into a fantastic high school, all white. And from my high school, I got into a fantastic university. I'm now chancellor of that university, Stellenbosch. And at Stellenbosch, I got the Rhodes Scholarship to come to Oxford, where you've just finished your BCL. All white. At the time I got the Rhodes Scholarship to come up to Oxford in 1976, there'd never been a Black South African. The first African Black South African was Loisa Nonga, who became and still is one of my closest friends. We met at Oxford. And we met at Oxford, and this goes back to your question, just a month or two at the end of 1977, after Stephen Bantu Biko had been beaten to death by the South African security police. Why was Stephen Bantu Biko beaten to death? Because he was dangerous, and his thoughts and ideas and his speech were dangerous. He was a beautiful, expressive, highly conceptually intelligent man who advocated the idea of Black pride, of absence of renunciation of Black shame, renunciation of white pride. And he said, Blacks must learn not to feel inferior, just as whites must learn not to feel superior. So meeting Loisa Nonga in the Rhodes house, Cecil John Rhodes's gifted house, all the ironies that my pivotal moment and my first really close Black friend was Loisa, who later became Vice Chancellor of Wits University. He got his maths PhD at Oxford. So it took me a long time to see that whiteness lies partly in disavowing your entitlement to privilege, partly in recognizing where it's brought you, partly in recognizing disparaging attitudes. Oh, a Black taxi driver, you know. To give a relatively trivial but very important part of the answer, that when you see a Jewish person or a Muslim woman or a trans person, there are elemental reactions that impinge themselves on your consciousness. But of course, there's the structural dimension as well. There's the Codrington, beautiful library, magnificent statue of its founder, sugar-rich from Black slave labor. And that we still have to address, and that we cannot unlearn. We have to deal with it systemically, and it's our generation's and your generation's duty to deal with it systemically.
In response to what you said, I think I've got two questions, if that's okay. I think the first one is, what was the process like for you making your first good Black friend? In that, when you first met him, did you have any sort of preconceptions about Black people? How did you sort of get past the messaging in your head, the negative messaging in your head about Black people, to make a friendship, a lifelong friendship with a Black person? And then second, I am of the school of thought as well that white privilege exists and that institutional racism exists, but particularly in my country, and I think in the United States, there's a lot of resistance to these ideas. And so I was wondering if you could perhaps give tangible examples of how white privilege is systemic, or how racism is systemic in general, and how to get through to people who think that these things are not real, or that alternatively it's some sort of hostile act to talk about them, if that makes sense.
It certainly does. Thank you very much, Seun. Can we start with the second question, and then I'll come back to, because when you asked me the first part of the question about getting over my own preconceptions, I felt myself starting to go red, even though I'm 68 years old and I've been in positions of responsibility, because there's some very self-mortifying answers to your question, which I might not give here this afternoon. But let's start with the second question. Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is a luminously brilliant African-American, Black American writer, he speaks about reparations. And I think that's right. To get to reparations, of course, you have to do the anterior step, which is recognition. You've got to say, our society and our constitution was built on a monstrosity. And that's, of course, what the debate is about in America, because people are deeply angry and resistant to that. Can I say something about your parents' country of origin, Seun? Nigeria was relatively untouched by white subordination, white colonialism, white oppression. South Africa, we had it institutionalized for 350 years, deeply, systematically ingrained in the law, especially after the apartheid government came into power. There was, it was like the anti-Jewish laws from 1933 in Germany. There was a deeply systematic degradation of Black people's dignity and the exclusion from opportunities in favor of white people like myself. So I think it's true. My spouse comes from Eswatini, which is a neighboring country just 3 hours drive from where I'm sitting now. And it's in turmoil now because it's got Africa's last autocratic monarchy, and the police are behaving there with enormous brutality. The fatality figure after a couple of weeks is 50 people killed and many, many more people brutalized. But the point I want to make is that the Amaswati were never conquered. They were a British protectorate, but they were never subjected to systematic denigration and degradation at the hands of an all-powerful white authority. So I think when West Africans say, what are you guys on about internalized shame? Steve Biko spoke about internalized shame about Blackness. I speak about internalized shame as someone living with HIV and as living as a queer person. The tracks of your external stigmatization are left inside you in your own consciousness. But my Nigerian friends say, what are you South Africans on about this racism? And of course, it's different histories. So I wanted to say that, but I think to go back to recognition, to have recognition, you need history, and you need to be truthful about your history. This wasn't a happy plantation with the house, Black people inside singing cradle songs to the white little kiddies. It was a system of inexpressible brutality to sustain the labor outputs of those people in conditions of degradation that they had to endure. And we have to understand that. These are facts of history. And if you refuse to accept the Holocaust, if you refuse to accept the benefits in current white societies like the UK and America of exploitation of Black people through slavery and the slave trade in England, then you're denying history.
I agree with everything that you said, but I think perhaps in Nigeria, I think we have different colonial wounds, but I think there was still oppression there. It's just that there wasn't a settler community. But even
I once said to a Namibian lady, the grandmother of a close friend, who participated in the Namibian struggle for independence from South Africa, that Namibia was less, and I got a scorching. I got flamed out for the rest of the evening. So I'm very conscious of that any form of colonial intrusion and the setting up of a colonial structure does have an impact, but there are degrees. So thank you for saying that.
I wanted to ask, because I think one contention that I think certain types of conservative in my country and in the US have is that, my country being the UK, being that slavery, for example, they argue happened a long time ago. So perhaps you as a South African can talk about structural racism because apartheid only ended in the 90s, but slavery happened a long, long time ago. A lot of the former colonial countries gained their independence in the mid-20th century. shouldn't we all move on, I guess is the argument.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, what do you make of that argument?
Yeah. Let's all move on. Let's be happy. So, I don't agree with that. Let me tell you a very different story. My very first Pesach Seder that I went to was in 1982 in Johannesburg. I hadn't turned 30 yet. I was in the process of coming out. It was a very, very close friend who invited me. And I'd known Jewish people before, but I'd never been for a Sabbath meal. At that Pesach table, at that Seder, there were people whose parents had experienced the pogroms in Lithuania and Ukraine and in Russia. And their memory of it still influenced their children and their grandchildren. We don't shake off history. And I think slavery was abolished when I grew up in the 1950s and 60s. Slavery had existed less than a century before in the United States. And unless you understand the structural dynamics of society, which was a great addition to our insight in the 19th century. Freud taught us to understand the unconscious and the subconscious. Karl Marx taught us, he had many, many wrong doctrines. I'm not preaching Marxism, but he spoke about structure and the determinants of accumulation and wealth accumulation and the class determinants. And of course, he didn't speak much about race. In fact, he said some horrible things about Black people. But unless you are willing to understand the structural determinants of power in any society and to understand them historically, you are missing an important dimension of how we live today.
Just linked to what you said, actually, I wanted to ask, I wanted to bring back the question I asked about your experiences making your first Black friend and
Yes.
any sort of preconceptions you had. And then second, because I think the point you make about Marxism, that sort of what Marx pointed out, despite not necessarily proclaiming that you're a Marxist, I think is interesting, because I think today, many people argue that Black Lives Matter activists are Marxists. During apartheid, many people argued that Black anti-apartheid activists were Marxists. During the civil rights struggle in the United States, many people argued that Martin Luther King Jr. and others were Marxists. And I wonder, what do you think of this Marxist term for any sort of Black freedom fighter? And yeah, what do you think it means that these activists are constantly called Marxists?
Well, certainly in the South African struggle, the South African Communist Party, which claimed to be Marxist, was actually a Stalinist party. And the South African Communist Party, including my former colleague in the Constitutional Court, Justice Eddie Sachs, never broke with Moscow. Most conscientious people broke with the Stalinist communists after 1956. A lot of others broke after Prague in 1968. The South African Communist Party, for strategic reasons, never did. So there certainly were Marxists, and many of them were leaders in the struggle for liberation, because they understood that although the class structure was mediated through race in South Africa, with the Black people being both the underclass and the working class, nevertheless there was a class dimension as well. So they're not exclusionary, and one can derive eclectic insights from many philosophies. And I think the important thing about Black Lives Matter is not that it's a Marxist movement, or that you have to be a Marxist to share some of its insights and impulses and goals, but to accept that some people will be there. But certainly in America, until Bernie Sanders started saying, I'm a socialist, to be called a socialist was like to be called a red devil and a heretic. So I think the Marxist label is being used to demonize some people in the BLM.
And then just on your friendship, your first friendship, I was wondering how did you form that, and what sort of preconceptions did you have?
I thought I was going to escape that. You know, Seun, it's a lovely point as we might be drawing to the end of our conversation. It's a lifelong process of learning humility about women, about trans people, about lesbians, about Black people, about people of other faiths. It's a lifelong process, and I'm very grateful for my closest Black friends who are Louisa Nonma, Tina Malindi, Dunstan Mlambo, and many other friends that I now have. The wonderful thing about being queer in South Africa in the 1980s and 90s is that you met working class and non-working class queer people because you were all queer. And I've got many, many queer, lesbian and Black friends whom I'm deeply grateful for. But I was thinking with embarrassment of some of the things, and I'm very glad our time is running out so that I don't have to go into a confessional now. But the gaucheness, the inappropriateness, the preconceptions that one brings to a formally stigmatized relationship when you try to supplant it with reverence and respect and even veneration, they do remain in memory. And sometimes you can laugh at yourself, and sometimes you feel embarrassment rising.
Thank you for answering the question. Sorry for putting you on the spot. So yes, I think we've come to the end.
Let me tell you a little story, Seun. My sister and I, when my sister looked after me during my matric years, and there was a woman called Margaret Mohamotsi who taught me a lot as well. And I told a Dutch journalist for the first time last year that we initially had a separate set of an enamel plate and mug for her, which we did away with, my sister and I, when we were both still teenagers. But I remembered with hot embarrassment that sign of subordination in our own kitchen. This was a woman who was washing our clothes and making our beds. And after she died, and we were honored to be invited to her funeral, and I was asked to speak at it, which was an enormous honor, her daughter came around, and my sister had a little 3-year-old who's now a very impressive activist called Marlies Richter. And Marlies went up to the granddaughter of Margaret Mohamotsi, and she rubbed her hands over the little baby's head. And it was a touching moment, and we all laughed. But it reminded me of the curiosity that a lot of people express in racist terms about the difference with Black people. And it reminded me of the way that we exoticize Black people, or Black males, or Black women through the differences. And that's part of why it's so important for young kids to grow up knowing right from nursery school. Yes, the homophobic activists are right. We've got to start in nursery school with anti-homophobia. And we've got to start in nursery school because that little kid was the first one that Marlies had seen in her parents' household. And then she wouldn't have done that out of amazement with the hair difference. It would have just been part of a wonderful diversity of humanity.
Yes, I agree. Education definitely is key.
And experience. Just ordinary experience.
Yeah.
But some kids in 2-year-olds in nursery school have 2 daddies. Some kids in 2-year-old nursery school have 2 mummies, or 1 daddy or 1 mummy. It doesn't matter.
Yes, well, on that note, I think I could talk with you for another hour, but I think we've come to the end of our hour. So thank you very much for spending time with me. Sorry for the difficult questions. And yeah, thank you for being here. I really, really enjoyed speaking with you.
What a joy and a privilege. Thank you for your care, Seun.
Thank you so much for listening to today's interview with Mr. Edwin Cameron. My name is Seun Matiluko, and I'm the founder of the OLBA Network. To find out more about the OLBA Network, please check out our page on the faculty website.